I was the woman behind every successful product launch our company celebrated. The strange thing was that almost nobody outside my department knew it. They knew the CEO. They knew the investors. They knew the executives who stood on stage during quarterly meetings and talked about innovation. But the person who actually designed the systems making those promises possible, that part usually disappeared somewhere near the bottom of the presentation. My name is Lauren Mitchell. For 6 years, I had served as Principal Product Systems Director at Vertex Dynamics, a fast-growing enterprise software company specializing in predictive logistics platforms. Officially, I managed product architecture. Unofficially, I translated ambitious executive promises into systems that actually worked. If a major client signed a contract, chances were I had built part of the platform that convinced them. If investors praised our technology during earnings calls, chances were I had spent months solving the problems they were describing in a single sentence. I didn't mind being behind the scenes, at least not at first. I loved the work, the complexity, the challenge. Watching thousands of moving parts come together into something useful. There's a satisfaction that comes from solving problems most people never even notice exist. For years that was enough. Then the company started getting bigger. And bigger companies often develop interesting ideas about who deserves credit. Our CEO Marcus Reed was excellent at attracting attention. 41 years old. Charismatic. Confident. Always perfectly dressed. The kind of executive who could make investors believe a roadmap was already reality. To be fair, he was talented. But there was a difference between selling a vision and building one. I spent most of my time doing the second part. Marcus spent most of his time taking credit for both. The first time I noticed the pattern was during a major client acquisition 3 years earlier. Our team had spent 8 months developing a forecasting engine capable of reducing inventory costs across complex supply chains. It wasn't easy. The algorithms required thousands of hours of testing. My engineers worked weekends. Our data scientists practically lived inside simulation models. When the system finally launched, it exceeded every target. The client renewed immediately. Industry publications covered the project. Investors loved it. During the company-wide celebration meeting, Marcus thanked everyone. Sales, marketing, business development, investor relations. Then he moved on. No mention of engineering. No mention of product architecture. No mention of the team that built the thing. Several employees noticed. I remember my colleague Sarah texting me afterward. Did he seriously forget the entire development team? I replied with a single word. Apparently. At the time I laughed it off. One incident didn't matter. Then it happened again. And again. And again. Eventually a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The bigger the success, the less visible the people doing the actual work became. Especially if those people preferred solving problems over promoting themselves. I learned to live with it. Mostly. What I didn't realize was that the situation would eventually become much larger than professional recognition. Because 6 years into my time at Vertex, the company started pursuing the biggest acquisition in its history. A software firm called Novosphere Analytics. If the deal succeeded, Vertex would nearly double its market position overnight. The acquisition became known internally as Project Atlas. Only a handful of executives were officially involved, at least according to the organizational chart. The reality was different, because nearly every technical assessment supporting Project Atlas passed through my team. Security reviews, scalability models, infrastructure integration planning, data migration forecasts, risk analysis. My department produced almost all of it. I spent months reviewing Novosphere systems, sometimes 12 hours a day, sometimes more. The acquisition would only succeed if the technical integration plan worked. And I was the person responsible for determining whether it could. By spring, I knew Novosphere's architecture almost as well as my own company's, which was why the emails surprised me. Subject: Vertex Strategic Vision Retreat. Location: Blackstone Mountain Resort. Attendance: Executive Leadership Team. Board members. Investor representatives. Selected department heads. I opened the attendee list. Read it twice. Then a third time. My name wasn't there. First I assumed it was a mistake. Project Atlas was scheduled to be the centerpiece of the retreat. Half the presentation depended on analysis my team had created. Surely someone had forgotten to add me. That explanation lasted about 20 minutes. Then I walked into Marcus Reed's office. He looked up from his laptop. "Lauren, quick question." "Sure." I saw the attendee list for Blackstone. Marcus nodded. "So, my name isn't on it." For a moment something flickered across his face. Not surprise. Recognition. As if he had expected this conversation. Oh. That single word told me everything. Not an accident. Not an oversight. Intentional. "It's mostly strategic discussions," he said. I stared at him. "Project Atlas is a strategic discussion. We already have your reports." There it was. The sentence. The one I would replay in my head for months afterward. We already have your reports. Not your expertise. Not your perspective. Not your contribution. Just the documents. The information without the person who created it. I forced myself to stay calm. "Marcus, I've spent 6 months leading the technical side of this acquisition. And you've done excellent work." Then he smiled. The kind of smile executives use when they want a conversation to end. "Don't worry. We'll represent the technical position." Represent it. The same way someone represents a language they don't actually speak. I thanked him. Left the office. Walked directly to the nearest empty conference room. Closed the door. And sat there staring at the wall. For the first time in 6 years I wasn't angry. I was clear. Because suddenly I understood something. I wasn't being excluded because my work lacked value. I was being excluded because my work had value. Enough value that people wanted ownership of the story without including the person who created it. And once you realize you're being hidden rather than overlooked, you start seeing everything differently. The conference invitation arrived 2 weeks after the Blackstone retreat list was finalized. Normally I would have declined. My schedule was already overloaded. Project Atlas consumed most of my time. My engineering teams were preparing integration simulations. Client deadlines were approaching. And I had very little interest in spending 3 days listening to executives talk about disruption and transformation. Then I noticed the keynote speakers. One name immediately caught my attention. Daniel Foster, Chief Executive Officer of Novasphere Analytics. The very company Vertex was trying to acquire. That changed things. If Project Atlas moved forward, Novasphere would become one of the most important business relationships in my professional life. Understanding their leadership team mattered. So I accepted. The conference took place in Seattle. More than 2,000 technology professionals attended. Executives, product leaders, engineers, investors, industry analysts. The usual mix of people trying to predict the future while struggling to manage the present. My presentation was scheduled for the second day. A technical session about predictive infrastructure systems. Nothing particularly dramatic. Just practical lessons learned from large-scale implementation projects. I expected maybe 50 attendees. Instead, the room filled completely. People stood along the walls. Additional chairs had to be brought in. Afterward, dozens of attendees stayed behind asking questions. The discussion lasted almost an hour longer than planned. When it finally ended, I was gathering my notes when someone approached. Tall, gray suit, silver conference badge. Confident but relaxed. I recognized him immediately. Daniel Foster, Novasphere CEO. Lauren Mitchell? I nodded. Daniel Foster. He smiled. I know. That surprised me. Most executives at his level rarely paid attention to individual product leaders, especially at competing companies. I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. No. He shook his head. I really enjoyed it. Then he said something unexpected. You actually understand the systems you're talking about. I laughed. That's generally helpful. He laughed too. For the next 20 minutes we discussed technology, architecture, scaling challenges, implementation failures, customer expectations, real conversations, not executive theater, not sales language, actual professional discussion. And something became obvious very quickly. Daniel knew Project Atlas existed. Of course he did. The acquisition discussions weren't public. But both companies had been conducting due diligence for months. The industry wasn't blind. Eventually he asked a question. How involved are you in the integration planning? I hesitated, then answered honestly. Very. His expression suggested that confirmed something. Interesting. At the time I didn't understand why. I would later. Much later. The conference ended. I returned home and immediately walked back into the strange reality developing inside Vertex. The Blackstone retreat had apparently been a tremendous success, according to Marcus, according to investor communications, according to every executive presentation circulating through the company. Project Atlas was progressing beautifully. Everyone seemed delighted, except the people actually doing the work. 3 days after returning from Seattle, I attended a technical review meeting. Engineering, security, infrastructure, data migration, all the people responsible for execution. The mood was noticeably tense. One of my senior architects, Kevin, looked exhausted. What happened? He slid a document across the table. I started reading, then kept reading, then read it again. These were revised integration assumptions approved during the Blackstone retreat. Several critical technical requirements had been changed. Not adjusted. Changed. Substantially. Without consulting the people responsible for implementation. I looked up. Who approved this? Kevin answered immediately. Marcus. Of course. Along with several executives who had never managed a system migration of this scale. The revisions looked impressive on paper. Investors would love them. Analysts would probably love them too. The problem was that parts of the plan no longer reflected technical reality. Some deadlines had been shortened. Resource requirements reduced. Infrastructure risks minimized. Everything looked cleaner, simpler, more optimistic, and significantly less accurate. I spent the next several weeks trying to correct the situation. Meetings, reports, presentations, risk assessments. Every effort focused on explaining the same thing. You cannot negotiate with technical limitations. Reality doesn't care about investor expectations. Sometimes systems require the time they require, the resources they require, the expertise they require. No amount of executive enthusiasm changes that. Unfortunately, enthusiasm remained abundant. Then something unexpected happened. One evening while reviewing migration scenarios, I received an email. The sender made me stop reading for several seconds. Daniel Foster. Subject. Good speaking with you. The message was short, professional, friendly. He referenced our conversation in Seattle, mentioned several technical points, then included one sentence that immediately caught my attention. I hope we're able to work together more closely in the future. Interesting wording. Not suspicious. Just interesting. At the time, I assumed he was referring to the acquisition. Nothing more. The following month, however, things started becoming strange. Very strange. During a Project Atlas executive briefing, Marcus presented integration timelines to investors. Timelines my team had never approved. Timelines we had explicitly warned against. When the presentation ended, I requested a private conversation. Marcus seemed annoyed before I even spoke. We need to talk about those projections. They're aggressive. They're impossible. That word hung in the air. Marcus leaned back. Lauren, investors expect confidence. I stared at him. Investors also expect results. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave me a look I had seen before. The look executives use when expertise becomes inconvenient. The meeting ended without resolution. 2 days later, I received another surprise. An email from Investor Relations. Project Atlas Stakeholder Update. Attached was a communication package describing the acquisition strategy. The document referenced technical assessments, risk analysis, integration planning, forecasting models. Work created almost entirely by my department. My name appeared exactly once. In the appendix. Buried beneath several pages of executive commentary. That was the moment I realized the problem was much larger than professional recognition. Because people weren't simply taking credit anymore. They were making decisions based on work they didn't fully understand. And eventually, that always creates consequences. What none of us knew was that those consequences were about to arrive much sooner than anyone expected. And they were going to come directly from Novosphere. The first sign that something had changed came during a board review meeting in early September. Project Atlas had reached a critical stage. Months of negotiations, technical reviews, financial analysis, legal due diligence. Everything was moving toward a final agreement. At least that was the official story. Then Marcus received a call from Novosphere. Not from their legal department. Not from their finance team. From Daniel Foster personally. Within hours, an emergency executive meeting appeared on everyone's calendars. I wasn't invited. That wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was how people looked afterward. Confused. Concerned. Some seemed frustrated. Others seemed worried. Nobody seemed optimistic. The following morning, Sarah appeared at my office. She closed the door before speaking. Something happened. I looked up from my laptop. What? I don't know exactly. That got my attention. Sarah always knew exactly. But whatever it is, the executive team has been in meetings since yesterday. Interesting. Very interesting. 3 days later, I finally learned the reason. Not through official channels. Through Kevin. One of the advantages of working in technology is that information rarely stays contained for long. Kevin sat down across from me. His expression alone told me this wasn't routine news. You're not going to believe this. Try me. He lowered his voice. Novosphere wants you involved in the integration leadership team. For several seconds I said nothing. I genuinely thought I had misunderstood him. What? Daniel specifically requested it. I stared at him. That didn't make sense. At least not immediately. Why? Kevin shrugged. Apparently he believes you're the person who actually understands the technical integration. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Because I knew exactly how that statement would be received by Vertex leadership. Not well. For years, executives had carefully controlled the narrative surrounding Project Atlas. Officially, it was a collaborative effort led by senior leadership. In reality, most of the technical foundation came from my department. Now the CEO of the acquisition target had essentially confirmed it. Publicly. To negotiators. To board members. To investors. That created a problem. A very large problem. Especially for people who preferred receiving credit without sharing visibility. Over the next week, rumors spread throughout the company. Some exaggerated. Some completely inaccurate. But one fact remained consistent. Novosphere viewed me as a critical participant in the acquisition. Not Marcus. Not investor relations. Not strategy. Me. The person who hadn't been invited to the retreat. The person excluded from executive discussions. The person whose expertise was apparently useful but whose presence was not. Then came the board meeting. The one that changed everything. I wasn't there. But by the end of the day, everyone knew what had happened. Daniel Foster had presented Novosphere's final integration requirements. Most were expected. Governance structure. Technical milestones. Resource commitments. Then came the unexpected condition. Novosphere wanted continuity of technical leadership. Specifically, they wanted me leading the integration architecture team after the acquisition. Not assisting. Not advising. Leading. According to several people who attended the meeting, the room went silent. Board members immediately started asking questions. Questions that became increasingly uncomfortable. Why wasn't Lauren already part of executive planning? Why wasn't she attending negotiation meetings? Why hadn't they heard her name before? Why was Novosphere placing so much importance on someone largely absent from Vertex's presentations? Excellent questions. Unfortunately for Marcus, they were arriving very late. That evening, he appeared at my office. The first time in months. Lauren. I looked up. Marcus. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sat down. I think we should discuss your role in Project Atlas. There it was. The sudden recognition. Not because my value had changed. Because visibility had changed. People often confuse those two things. I thought you already had my reports. His expression tightened slightly. He remembered the conversation. Good. 'Cause I remembered it too. Things have evolved. Of course they had. They always evolve when powerful people begin asking difficult questions. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus outlined a revised leadership structure. More involvement, more visibility, more responsibility. Everything I should have received months earlier. The timing wasn't subtle. Neither was the motivation. When he finished, I asked a simple question. Why now? He didn't answer immediately, because there wasn't a good answer. Eventually, he settled on something vague about organizational alignment. I nodded politely, then changed the subject. The conversation ended. Nothing was resolved, because the real issue wasn't a title. It wasn't a meeting invitation. It wasn't even recognition. The real issue was trust. And trust, once damaged, rarely returns overnight. Meanwhile, another unexpected development was unfolding. Daniel Foster contacted me again. This time the conversation was direct. No ambiguity. No corporate language. No strategic phrasing. Just honesty. I need to ask you something. We were speaking over video conference. I already suspected where the discussion was heading. Okay. Are you planning to stay at Vertex? The question caught me off guard. Not because it was inappropriate, because it was precise. I thought carefully before answering. I haven't decided. That was true. For the first time in years, I genuinely hadn't decided. Daniel nodded, then said something that would eventually change my entire career. Good. I raised an eyebrow. Why? Because he smiled. The kind of smile people use when they already know something you don't. And suddenly I realized this conversation wasn't really about Project Atlas anymore. It was about what came after. What none of us expected was how quickly that future would arrive. Because only 2 weeks later, the acquisition negotiations would suffer a setback so severe that investors would begin questioning whether the deal could survive at all. And when that happened, every decision Marcus had made over the previous year would come back to haunt him. The setback arrived on a Tuesday morning. At 8:17 a.m., an emergency meeting invitation appeared on the calendars of nearly every senior leader involved in Project Atlas. By 8:30, conference rooms across Vertex were full. By 9 o'clock, rumors had already started spreading. And by noon, everyone understood one thing. Something had gone very wrong. Officially, nobody was saying much. Unofficially, information was everywhere. Investors were concerned. The board was concerned. The legal teams were concerned. Most importantly, Novosphere was concerned. Not about the technology. Not about the financial terms. About leadership. For months, Daniel Foster and his team had been reviewing how Vertex operated. Not just systems. People. Decision-making structures. Project governance. Communication channels. Everything. And the conclusions apparently weren't encouraging. That afternoon, Sarah called me. Have you seen the investor update? No. They delayed the signing announcement. I sat back in my chair. That was significant. Very significant. Public announcements don't get delayed without reason. Especially not deals this large. What happened? No one knows. But I had a feeling. Because later that evening Daniel called. His tone was calm, professional, yet noticeably different. The board requested additional assurances. There it was. Assurances. Corporate language for trust issues. What kind of assurances? He didn't answer immediately. Then, they want confidence that the people responsible for building the integration plan will actually be allowed to lead it. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Because we both knew exactly what that meant. Novosphere had identified a problem. Not technical. Organizational. They had spent months evaluating the acquisition and concluded that the people creating the strategy weren't necessarily the people making the decisions. And that made them nervous. It should have. The following week became one of the most chaotic periods in Vertex history. Board members started asking harder questions. Investors requested additional reviews. Internal communications became increasingly tense. For the first time, executives were being forced to explain decisions they had previously made without challenge. And many of those explanations weren't particularly convincing. Then came the moment everything changed. A special board review was scheduled. Attendance mandatory. Department heads included. For the first time in the entire Project Atlas process, I received an invitation. I almost laughed when I saw it. Almost. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Board members, investors, executives, outside advisors. Everyone was there. And for the first time, I watched people ask the questions that should have been asked a year earlier. Who created the integration framework? Who conducted the technical risk analysis? Who designed the migration architecture? Who built the implementation roadmap? Every answer led back to the same place. My department. My team. My work. The room grew noticeably quieter as that reality became impossible to ignore. Several board members seemed genuinely surprised. One investor finally asked the question nobody else wanted to say out loud. If Lauren's team created most of the technical foundation, why hasn't she been involved in strategic leadership discussions? Nobody answered immediately. Because there wasn't a good answer. Only uncomfortable ones. That silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Felt much longer. After the meeting ended, multiple board members approached me directly. Not because I had suddenly become more qualified. Because they had finally learned who I was. The difference mattered. A month later, Project Atlas officially collapsed. Not permanently, but effectively. The acquisition was postponed indefinitely. Public statements described it as a strategic reassessment. The reality was simpler. Trust had eroded. Novosphere no longer believed Vertex could execute the integration effectively under the existing leadership structure. And without that confidence, the deal stopped moving forward. The financial consequences were immediate. Market analysts criticized the failure. Investors demanded accountability. The board launched a formal review of acquisition management. Marcus Reed remained CEO. But his influence changed dramatically. For years he had controlled the narrative. Now people were paying attention to the details behind it. At the same time, something unexpected happened. Daniel Foster invited me to dinner. Professional. Private. No negotiation teams. No lawyers. No executives. Just a conversation. Halfway through the evening he asked a question. Have you ever considered leaving Vertex? I smiled. I've considered a lot of things recently. He nodded. Then slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer. Chief Product Integration Officer. Novosphere Analytics. Executive Leadership Team. Direct Board Visibility. Authority over product strategy and enterprise integration. I stared at the document. Then looked at him. This is serious. Very. The compensation package exceeded anything I had previously imagined. But honestly, the salary wasn't what caught my attention. It was the opportunity. The chance to build something instead of defending it. The chance to contribute without constantly fighting for visibility. The chance to work somewhere expertise wasn't treated as an inconvenience. I accepted 3 weeks later. The announcement created shockwaves throughout the industry. Not because I was famous. Because people understood what it meant. The person responsible for much of Vertex's technical foundation was leaving. And she was joining the company they had tried to acquire. Industry publications covered the move. Analysts discussed it. Recruiters suddenly started contacting half my department. Several followed me to Novosphere over the next year. Not because I asked them to. Because talented people prefer environments where their work is respected. My first year at Novosphere became the most successful period of my career. We launched new platforms. Expanded internationally. Completed integrations that competitors considered impossible. Employee retention reached record levels. Revenue exceeded projections. Most importantly, people received credit for their contributions. A surprisingly rare achievement in corporate environments. Almost 18 months after leaving Vertex, I attended an industry leadership summit in Chicago. More than 3,000 executives attended. The largest conference of its kind. I was scheduled to deliver the opening keynote. As I walked backstage, someone called my name. I turned around. Marcus Reed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. A genuine smile. Not a corporate one. You were right. I laughed softly. About what? About expertise. Simple words. Honest words. Probably the most honest conversation we'd ever had. We spoke for a few minutes. No resentment. No hostility. Just perspective. Before leaving, Marcus paused. Then said something I'll never forget. I spent years trying to make the company look successful. He looked around the convention center. You spent those same years making it successful. Then he walked away. A few minutes later, I stepped onto the stage. Thousands of people sat in front of me. Executives, founders, investors, engineers, future leaders. As the lights brightened, I thought about the journey that brought me there. The missed opportunities, the frustrations, the meetings where my work was presented without my name attached to it. The moments when being invisible felt easier than speaking up. And I realized something important. Recognition isn't the same as value. A person can create enormous value without receiving recognition. But eventually, if the value is real, the recognition tends to find its way there anyway. Not always quickly, not always fairly, but eventually. Because expertise leaves evidence. Results leave evidence. Leadership leaves evidence. And unlike presentations, titles, or corporate narratives, evidence is very difficult to hide forever. That became the greatest lesson of my career. You don't build a reputation by demanding credit. You build it by doing exceptional work consistently enough that eventually nobody can ignore where the results came from. And once that happens, opportunities appear that no executive can take away, no matter how hard they try.